Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. Get updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-855-937-4977. Getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. Before we jump into our watches, warnings, and advisories, I want to start off with a quick look at southeast Alaska moving into this nighttime, or tonight and into tomorrow. We are going to see heavy precipitation, heavy rain actually, starting up north by Yakutat area and actually spreading farther to the east over time tonight and tracking in by the time we get into tomorrow morning, into noontime tomorrow. We are expecting that to have pushed down into the southern portions of the Panhandle as well. What's unique about this is that we're actually having the heaviest precipitation start more to the west and then pushing east over time, when generally we have a lot of our heaviest precipitation come up from the south and moving to the north. Staying down in southeast Alaska, we'll look at our first advisory here. This is a winter weather advisory for snow up in the Klondike Highway area near White Pass. We are expecting to see snow amounts of 4 to 7 inches. This is going to start later tonight and go through tomorrow afternoon. We could see winds up to 45 miles per hour as well. This is for areas above 1,500 feet, which does mean that we are expecting rain for Skagway itself, and it is going to be on the highway closer towards White Pass, where we'll start to see more of the heavy snow. Taking a look now at the rest of the warnings and advisories that we have out for the state. Start off in the southern locations. We have winter weather advisories for the Susitna Valley and Alaska Range still in effect. Some of that snow is going to last through this evening, but then start to taper off, especially as we get to the nighttime hours. We also have a winter weather advisory in the Copper River Basin. This is actually going to be for a mix of precipitation, snow, and the potential for some freezing rain with that as well. So we do expect some ice accumulations. That's going to be primarily tomorrow. And then out over much of mainland Alaska, starting in the southwestern interior, moving into the Brooks Range as well. We are still seeing some heavier snowfall, and that's going to last into tomorrow. And then in the more northern locations of the Brooks Range, that heavier snowfall is going to start to be accompanied by some stronger winds, which means we're going to see some wind chills and blowing snow with the snowfall lasting into Thursday. Some of the worst conditions for that are going to be out by Ambler, some of the heaviest snowfall and lowest visibilities with that blowing snow. Through the Brooks Range, we could see wind chills dropping down to as low as 55 below. Finally, out by the west coast, we do have some areas of blowing snow out along the Chukchi Sea coastline out until St. Lawrence Island, and we could see those conditions lasting through tomorrow as well. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll start off with a low that we have by the eastern Aleutian Islands. This is producing a lot of precipitation out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians. So we look back out over mainland Alaska, we can see the cloud cover here stretching in a band from the southwestern portion of the state up to the northeast. That's what's bringing a lot of that heavier snowfall that we've been seeing for much of mainland Alaska. And finally, as we watch this loop once more, we'll track this system from the south. This is one that's going to be pushing into the Gulf of Alaska and going to be that heavy rain producer for the southeastern portion of the state. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we can see that system tracking in to the Gulf with a lot of southerly flow and warm air behind it. We are seeing rain all along the North Gulf Coast down into the Panhandle area. Some of the more northern areas and some of the areas at higher elevations will still see snow, and we'll definitely transition over to snow as we make it into mainland Alaska here from southwest Alaska through the interior and the Brooks Range, seeing quite a bit of snowfall there with some areas of blowing snow in the Brooks Range and along the west coast. Also underneath some high pressure along the Arctic coastline, we'll see some areas of fog. And then down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, a low out by the eastern Aleutians is producing snow throughout the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands, and a little bit warmer there by the eastern Aleutians especially. A mix of rain and snow is expected, and that's going to extend out by the Alaska Peninsula. As we move into tonight, that low is starting to track to the north and east, bringing those mixed precipitation areas more by the Alaska Peninsula, but still some snow behind it with the cold air tracking behind that system for the central Aleutians, and we can start to see our next system on the way towards the western Aleutians with some snow and strong winds coming with that low. Then out over mainland Alaska, snow is now spread throughout all of the mainland out towards the west coast as well. The only exception is going to be up along the Arctic coastline, where high pressure is keeping some of that precipitation at bay, but allowing for some fog to form underneath the high. Our system that was pushing towards the Gulf is now well into the Gulf overnight tonight, bringing in that heavier precipitation along the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle area. Once again, still keeping some snow at some of the more northern locations as well as at higher elevations. Then as we track into Wednesday, we're going to see a diminishment in the intensity of the precipitation, but still quite a bit of rain for the Panhandle along the North Gulf Coast into south central Alaska as well. Snow as we move farther inland, and we will see now our low that was over the Alaska Peninsula is now tracked over southwest Alaska, bringing snow continuing throughout much of the mainland, with some areas of blowing snow still lingering in the Brooks Range out towards the west coast as well, and some areas of fog still along the Arctic coastline. Our other system is pushed into the western Aleutians, bringing some snow towards the central and western Aleutians, and as we track into Thursday, some warmer air behind that mixed precipitation for the Aleutians now on Thursday, and that frontal system pushing into southwest Alaska, bringing some snow and blowing snow conditions back to the southwest coast. High pressure is diminishing some of the snow throughout mainland Alaska, and then down in the Panhandle, still hanging on to some rain for much of the Panhandle area. Northern locations could see some snow. For our low temperatures in the Panhandle for Wednesday morning, dropping down into the upper 30s to lower 40s. Out over south central Alaska, lower 30s into the upper 20s as we get farther to the north. Wednesday afternoon highs getting up into the mid 30s for interior locations, near 40 by the coastline, and then down in the Panhandle, lower 40s to mid 40s are expected. Thursday morning, temperatures dropping down into the mid 30s to lower 40s for the Panhandle, and then near 30 degrees for much of south central Alaska. As we move back into Thursday afternoon time frame, we are going to jump back up into the mid 30s to near 40 degrees for south central, and lower 40s to mid 40s for the Panhandle. In the interior, we are expecting temperatures to drop below zero for most locations Wednesday morning. The exception is going to be down in the southeastern portions of the interior. Could stay in the single digits there. Some of the coldest areas are going to be in the western interior by Galena and up through the pass of the Brooks Range. Along the Arctic coastline, minus teens are expected, and around minus 10 for the west coast. Wednesday afternoon highs going to get up into the mid 20s for southeastern portions of the interior, single digits for much of the rest of the interior, and near zero for the west coast of the state, and then getting around minus 10 for much of the Arctic coastline, still staying pretty cold up there. Thursday morning lows going to drop down below zero for most locations in the northern portions of the state. Again, the exception is going to be that very southeastern portion of the interior, and it's going to be the coldest along the Arctic coastline out by Dead Horse and Kaktovik, going to drop near minus 20. Thursday afternoon highs going to get back up into the 20s for the southeastern portions of the interior, single digits for much of the rest of the interior and west coast, but staying below zero along the Arctic coastline, around minus 10 for most locations. Wednesday morning lows for a southwestern portion of the state dropping below zero for the YK Delta area, down into the 20s for the Bristol Bay area, above freezing for some of the areas along the Alaska Peninsula, especially on the Pacific side of the peninsula. Then for the Aleutian Islands, dropping down to around 30 degrees, around 12 degrees for the Pribilof Islands. Wednesday afternoon high is going to get right around to zero for southwestern areas in YK Delta specifically, and then into the Bristol Bay area, dropping down into the 30s. Many locations staying above freezing for the Alaska Peninsula, and into the mid 30s for many of the Aleutian Islands. Thursday morning low is going to drop down below zero for the YK Delta area into the minus teens there, into the positive teens for the Bristol Bay area, around 30 degrees for much of the Alaska Peninsula, and around freezing for the Aleutian Islands. Dropping down a little bit colder there in the Pribilof Islands, down to 13. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into the 20s for the YK Delta area, and the mid 20s to near 30 degrees for the Bristol Bay area, near 40 degrees for the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Wednesday morning. Out over the Gulf of Alaska and all throughout the southeast, much of south central, especially near the Gulf, and down through Kodiak Island, expecting to see widespread IFR conditions. So IFR conditions are also going to extend out over southwest Alaska, western portions of the interior, and then up into the northern interior and Brooks Range, starting to clear up a little bit more along the Arctic coast with some MVFR up there, and then some VFR actually down along much of the west coast of the state. So look out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. IFR conditions out east extending out as far as the Pribilof Islands, and then MVFR conditions farther to the west. As we look into Wednesday afternoon, another system coming in from the west is going to bring IFR conditions to the western Aleutians. MVFR out ahead of that through the Alaska Peninsula. Some isolated areas of IFR, especially as we get closer towards Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island. Out over mainland Alaska, we're going to see a mix of VFR through IFR conditions, VFR out by the YK Delta. Then we have IFR from the Bristol Bay area up through the western interior, out by the Seward Peninsula and up into the Brooks Range as well. Isolated areas of VFR in the interior, and some areas of VFR along the Arctic coastline. As you drop down into the Gulf of Alaska, IFR conditions from the central and eastern areas extending out through all of southeast Alaska. Then on Thursday morning, continuing to see IFR conditions out through southeast into the Gulf of Alaska and up into south central Alaska as well. Starting to improve in those conditions as we move farther to the west, getting to be VFR conditions out through much of the Bristol Bay area as well as the YK Delta and pushing up into the Seward Peninsula as well. However, as we get to the Kotzebue Sound area, you're going to see IFR conditions extending east all throughout the Brooks Range, northern portions of the interior, and then some improving conditions once again along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Bering Sea, we are going to see an area of IFR extending with our system moving through from the west, pushing now into the Pribilof Islands area as well as the central Aleutians. Then on Thursday afternoon, that system pushes even farther east, making its way finally to the coastline of the YK Delta, extending those IFR conditions in there, and then making their way towards the eastern Aleutians as well, with VFR conditions behind that system. Out over the mainland, we are seeing primarily VFR conditions, especially in south central and the interior. Some areas of IFR as we get up into the Brooks Range and eastern Arctic coastline, and then some more IFR as we get down into the southern areas of the Panhandle and areas that are into the coastal ranges. MVFR conditions elsewhere extending into the Gulf of Alaska. For our passes starting up north, Anaktuvuk going to be IFR throughout the day on Wednesday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill both expected to be IFR as well. Rainy Pass expecting to be marginal conditions on Wednesday, and Windy will start off marginal and drop down to IFR. Isabel Pass expected to be IFR all day Wednesday, with Mentasta starting off IFR and then improving to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Tanita Pass IFR expected all day on Wednesday, as well as at Portage, and then Chilkoot and White both expected to be IFR all day Wednesday. Taking a look at our freezing level, we have some warmer air coming up from the south with freezing heights up to 6,000 feet over the Panhandle, but our surface freezing line moves through south central Alaska, then out through the southern portions of the Bering Sea. Looking at our icing areas up by the western Aleutians, between 1 and 10,000 feet there. For the Bristol Bay area, between 2 and 10,000 feet, icing extending up the west coast to be between 3 and 10,000 feet up by the Kotzebue Sound area. Over south central, between 2 and 8,000 feet expected. Areas of icing extending out to the east, between 3 and 10,000 feet over the northern portions of the Panhandle. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet over the northern portions of the Panhandle, out of a southwesterly direction, up to as high as 140 knots there. And another branch of the jet moving around some ridging out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, up to as high as 130 knots by the western Aleutians out of the southwest. For our 9,000-foot winds, strong winds out by the western Aleutians, 45 knots out of a southerly direction there. Then out over mainland Alaska, we're going to see southerly winds along all of the west coast up to as high as 50 knots and 45 knots out of a southwesterly direction over south central. Weaker winds farther to the north. Then out over the Panhandle, around 50 knots out of the westerly direction there, picking up quite a bit as we move into the western portions of Canada. Down to 3,000 feet, dropping down significantly out over the Panhandle area, relatively calm there. Then out over the western portions of mainland Alaska, that southerly flow around our low pressure system up to as high as 50 knots, strongest as we get farther to the north, and 75 knots out over the northwest coast. Some strong winds out of the south, out over the Aleutian Islands, 65 to 70 knots out of a primarily southerly direction, with that next system coming in, pushing in towards the central Aleutians. Finding their turbulence out over the central and western Aleutians below 3,000 feet is expected, and quite a bit of turbulence in southwest Alaska, as well as Kotzebue Sound area extending into the interior and down into southeast Alaska.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. But what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. But the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015, and the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
We know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early meltout. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. As we saw yesterday, we still have some easterly winds pushing off shore. That's going to start to push the ice edge and help it grow out farther to the west. However, by the end of the week, we do expect some southerly winds to come up. That's going to help push the ice farther back to the north. As we look at our marine forecast out over the southeastern portion of the state, starting off in the Gulf, northern portions of the Gulf, southerly winds 35 knots there. In southern portions, we do have southwesterly winds up to as high as 25 knots. In the inside waters, pretty gusty. We have southeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots, with gusts getting up to as high as 50 knots up by the Link Canal area. Then as we move into Thursday, dropping down quite a bit in the inside waters, still southeast, but only 15 to 20 knots expected. Eastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska, around 20 knots there, out of a more westerly direction. And then in the northern portions of the Gulf, we have westerly winds 20 knots expected. For south central Alaska and the Gulf waters, northern portions, we're going to see southerly winds 35 knots, dropping down to 25 to 30 knots out of a more westerly direction as we get in the western portions of the Gulf. In Cook Inlet, southerly winds 25 to 30 knots expected all the way down through the western Barren Islands area. And then out in Prince William Sound, northwesterly winds 25 knots expected. On Thursday, southerly winds in Prince William Sound around 10 knots there. Westerly flow out over much of the Gulf waters, 15 to 20 knots. And then in the Cook Inlet area, southerly winds 20 knots, becoming more westerly around 15 as we get closer towards the Barren Islands. Then for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting off around Kodiak Island, southwesterly winds 25 knots expected. Seas highest on the Gulf side of the island, 14 feet at the highest. And then out by the Alaska Peninsula on the Bering side, we're going to see southerly winds 20 knots by Bristol Bay, and then out closer towards Cold Bay, northwesterly winds 15 knots there. South to southwest winds on the Pacific side around 25 knots. Then on Thursday around Kodiak Island, southwesterly winds around 20 knots expected. On the Bering side of the peninsula, we are going to see southeasterly winds, weakest by Bristol Bay, 15 knots, picking up as we move to the west, getting up to as high as 30 knots there. And then south to southwest winds, 15 to 25 knots on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands on Wednesday, out by the eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 20 knots expected, getting stronger as we move farther to the west there. We are going to see winds out of a westerly direction on the Pacific side, around 35 knots, becoming more more northeasterly on the Bering side, around 30 knots there, and picking up quite a bit as we move out by the western Aleutians with that upcoming front, up to as high as 50 knots out of a southeasterly direction for the western Aleutians, with seas up to 22 feet. Then on Thursday, winds are going to diminish out west. Still pretty strong, though, out of a southerly direction, 35 knots, seas up to as high as 23 feet. And as we move out by the central Aleutian Islands, southerly winds 20 knots there, picking up by the eastern Aleutians, 35 to 40 knots out of that southerly direction. Along the west coast of the state, we are going to see primarily southerly flow, north and sound around 20 knots, 25 to 30 knots from St. Lawrence Island down by Nunavik Island. On the southern side of Nunavik Island, dropping down to 20 knots out of a northwesterly direction. Then out by St. Matthew Island, northerly winds around 25 knots and 20 knots by the Pribilofs. On Thursday, becoming much more easterly out over Norton Sound, around 20 knots there, 30 to 35 knots between Nunavik Island and St. Lawrence Island, and 30 knots on the south side of Nunavik Island. Easterly winds 35 knots by St. Matthew Island, and southerly winds 35 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Along the west or northwest coast, we're going to see northeasterly winds up to as high as 45 knots by the Capes, 40 knots as we get closer to Kotzebue Sound, and then south of the Bering Strait, we're going to get down to 30 knots there. All along the Arctic coastline, northeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots expected. As we move into Thursday, more easterly along the Arctic coastline, strongest out east up to as high as 30 knots, dropping down to near 20 knots by Utqiagvik. Down the northwest coast, 30 to 40 knots out of a northeasterly direction, weaker in the Kotzebue Sound area, south 15, and then 35 knots south of the Bering Strait out of an easterly direction. Recap for our weather, we have a system coming in from the west. This is what we saw with those stronger winds out by the western Aleutians, with this system moving through, bringing some snow to the western Aleutians as well. We have our low out by the eastern Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the peninsula. Widespread snow throughout mainland Alaska, with the exception along the Arctic coastline where we see some fog. We also have some areas of blowing snow in the Brooks Range and along the west coast, and then a mix of rain and snow all along the North Gulf Coast down into the Panhandle, with the system moving through the Gulf. On Wednesday, that system will have pushed farther to the north, but still having rain throughout the Panhandle area along the North Gulf Coast, mixing with snow in some of the areas around Cook Inlet. Widespread snow throughout much of the mainland Alaska, and still blowing snow for the Brooks Range and along the northwest coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.